Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. I'm your guest host, Stefan van Duyvendijk. I'm the Accounting Operations Evangelist here at Flowcast. I'm really excited to have our guest today, Rohit Lalwani, CPA, who's the controller with Bluecore. Rohit's been a user of Flowcast for a long time. He's given us a lot of valuable customer feedback. He's been on panels with us, so we just want to get him out here in this way and just really tell his story and get his background, and hopefully that's helpful to other people and they can kind of learn from it. So Rohit, would love for you to introduce yourself and give us a background, like bottom to top, where you started, in audit, or maybe it wasn't even in auditing, and what brought you to industry and what brought you all the way to Bluecore.
Sure. So thanks for the introduction and happy to be here. Name is Rohit Lalwani, as Stefan just said. Work as a controller at Bluecore currently. I originally grew up in Florida, got my degree in accounting and finance, and spent my first couple of years in tax. Well, enjoyed tax, but felt like I didn't understand the full side of the business, and therefore transferred over into audit, which I feel like in public accounting is the rite of passage. I spent a couple of years at a regional size firm before moving up to the Big Four, which landed me at Deloitte in New York. At Deloitte in New York, I spent most of my time on emerging growth companies and advertising clients. Very much enjoyed it, but didn't see myself as trying to make partner track on the long term. And with that being said, 7 o'clock at night one day, working those long hours that we usually do in public accounting, and got a call from a recruiter. And it wasn't something I was, originally considering, but startup company in technology. And the thought of going into a new company where I was the first finance hire, trying to figure things out and build things out seems very interesting to me. I would say I never knew I'd walk into the day where a copy of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks was sitting on my desk and said, all right, well, figure it out. That being said, probably one of the best experiences of my life, because that's when you truly get to see if you really know what you're doing or not. And so I spent a couple of years at an e-commerce company, which then moved me on towards a blockchain company. And I want to kind of go into the story about the blockchain company because this was around 2017, 18, when Bitcoin was starting to take off. And the company called Paxos, based out of New York. And I spent a lot of time getting to understand the crypto world and what it entailed in the accounting. After a couple of years in that space, Bluecore seemed like a perfect fit because of my background spent in technology and entertainment in my days at Deloitte. I wanted to get back into the advertising world. Bluecore personalizes automation on contacting retail customers, on behalf of retail customers, to all the different consumers. So that was a business I really understood, versus, let's say, the fintech space. And hence, because I understood it so well, the thought of working with some of these large retailers was really enticing to me. And so therefore, I made my way into Blueprint. I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but I've been there for about 3+ years. Love it.
That's awesome. So when you were at Deloitte as an audit, were you doing a lot of advertising firms? What was your industry of focus?
Sure. So my number one client was WPP, which is the largest conglomerate of advertising all over the world. So I would spend, a typical day would be for me is visiting 3 to 4 clients all on Park Avenue, one after the other. Really exciting thing, different mediums of advertising. You mix in WPP being my number one client. You mix in some emerging technology companies on there, anywhere from seed stage to Series A, Series B, Series C.
Very cool. So that's kind of interesting. It's I think it's to me it's very daring, and I applaud it that you went from like your industry of focus to being the sole accountant in a very different industry for your first role outside of public accounting. Like I feel like my experience when I'm trying to tell people, hey, it's maybe they're like, is it time for me to leave public accounting? And they want to know what to do. Everybody's natural inclination, regardless of the advice, is like, well, I do oil and gas. I should go work in oil and gas. So I do tech. I should go work at, I should go do rev rec at a SaaS company or whatever it is. And I was like, I had a lot of different industries, actually, fortunately, when I was in public accounting, but retail is one I was very comfortable with. So I was very happy to exit to retail. So that is a bold move, and that's awesome. And so you left there to then go for another very interesting role with crypto, which has really been, up until recent economic times, probably the number one thing talked about in the marketplace was crypto, whether it was from an investment point of view, whether it was from an accounting point of view. Now everybody's talking about the impairment of it. So that's a really dynamic industry. But now you're back in the advertising and tech space. So kind of converging what you learned, it sounded like, leaving industry into what you really knew from your public accounting days, right?
Sure. So, I mean, for me, I guess you see the news and you see the lack of accountants in the industry not growing as much. So I feel like this is an opportunity where if you are experienced, you could pick the industry that you want to go to. You don't have to be confined to an industry you studied in or worked on specifically in public accounting.
Right.
So I look at it as an opportunity and I'll be frank with you, I didn't really know anything about the blockchain industry a couple of years ago. I just knew it was the number one thing being talked about in different circles. And I said,
Yep.
let me go take an opportunity on it. Now, very compliance based, very cutting edge. I think one of the most interesting things about that role was that there's no precedence. So in theory, when you're sitting with different consultants and accounting folks, everything is just kind of being figured out as day by day because the industry was so new.
Yeah.
For me, the draw was always going to come back to advertising and media, just because I enjoyed it so much in public accounting. I knew at some point I wanted to spend more of my time here, but I wanted to venture out and see a different space.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think, like you said, it helps you think in a different mindset and you learn new and different things. And I felt that kind of transitioning out of accounting into this thought leadership marketing role at Flowcast. It just challenges your paradigms and makes you think of things a little bit differently. And not to say that changes your answer on things, but it definitely changes your process part of the way. So I think it can be really, really neat to kind of experience that. And I think it's very unsaid. I mean, you see so many leave public accounting in the past and they would say the same industry and they always want to work for big companies because they were used to working for a large accounting firm. And people kind of followed the size of their accounting firm to the size of the company they went and worked for. But it's really, you limit on what you can learn unless you kind of get exposure to both sides. So seeing the large and the small, you get like a much more rounded view of the accounting process and the reporting process. So taking a step back, when you first left accounting, you went to the fintech company. I feel like for me in my career, you kind of learn something every year or two, right? You kind of have like a different area of focus in your career. Not that a boss is telling you that or a mentor is telling that, just naturally you kind of identify your weakness or your new passion and you kind of focus on that. So for listeners that are maybe new, maybe looking to do that transition or just done that transition, for you, what was like some of the first things you learned going to that first that tech company that you went to? Was it an e-commerce company, I think?
Well, we'll talk the fintech. So the fintech, I think you harped on it initially. I love this question, by the way. I think, remember when you're coming out of public accounting, which a lot of us do, we're around the same people who learn the same things. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all have accounting backgrounds, who follow the same methodologies. If you think about it, if we go to 4 different companies, we're all going to employ the same 4 similar methodologies. And so walking into that fintech firm, first off, your accounting, there's not thousands of accounts around you. There's a couple. And so when you step into that role, you're around different ops people, you're around different HR people, you're around different fintech individuals with different ideas. And you go from thinking of just compliance, which is what you do in public space, to thinking about compliance only being part of the business and operations being a significant piece on that. Now, when you think operations, it's not just, okay, hey, pay this bill, pay that. It's on procurement, it's about overhead, it's about waste. There's just, you continue to open it up and you realize this accounting is just not a compliance world. And I know I spoke on one of your panels about a couple months ago, and a lot of the people in the audience were saying, I don't want to be so heavy in the compliance role, which kind of threw me off because I don't think of this as just a compliance role. I think there's just so much more to it, where if your purpose is just to make sure the books are right and to make sure the audit gets done, what are you doing for the rest of the time? Because I just don't think that takes up the entire day. And so when you're sitting around with these different individuals, you realize the world, or even the accounting world, is bigger than it actually is. That's one of the first things I realized as soon as I walked in, that, I was constantly thinking about the audit. Nobody else was. They were thinking about it for 1 month out of the year.
Yep. And that's funny. That's actually the first thing I feel like I learned was I went into it, and in public accounting, you're like, man, I'm the most important thing they have to deal with all year, because if we don't sign this audit report, they're going to, either they're going to have a real big issue with the SEC if they're a public company, or they're going to have a line of credit that could be called because they didn't get an audit issued on time, right? There's a lot of, kind of checks and balances in place to make sure that they're incentivized to get it done timely and correct. Yet, when I went into the industry myself, I realized it's like, I'm worried about making payroll tomorrow. Not even if the company's struggling, but like as a general mindset, you're worried about the operations tomorrow. You're not worried about operations that have occurred in the past, right? What's done is done. We want to report on it. We want to learn from it, but we're busy executing tomorrow. We're busy setting up for the future. And that's the big difference. I think I felt the same way coming out of public accounting, saying, compliance, we got to nail this close and everything, to understanding that, no, there's a broader operational need in the organization. And that is what you need to focus on, not compliance. So when the audit comes around, as you said, you're like, I care to get it done. It's not unimportant. It's just not of the most importance. And there's other things that really matter to a controller, that matter to a VP or a CFO than compliance, or even to an AR specialist, right? Like even your AR specialist, they're like, well, I want to do the audit right because my controller said I had to do it right, or whoever said we need to be done. But they're like, I'm worried about making sure that we collect on these bills, right? That I got the invoices out and that we're collecting on these invoices in time, because that matters to making the bottom line. Making sure you sign off on a report doesn't necessarily add up the same. So I think that's funny how it maybe that is very similar in the industry when you step out. So that's kind of what you first learned is kind of like that first introduction to that operational sense. And that's a lot of what Flowcast talks about, is that operational mindset, that operational excellence. That's what we try to bring to the market. Going along in your career to your, were there other areas that were of importance to you? Was it team management? Was there other skill sets? Or did you just get more and more into the operational mindset?
So I've always had a love for business, and that's kind of why I chose audit in the first place, because they said, what's the fastest way to kind of learn as much about the business as possible? I told you I started in tax, but tax was too minimal of a snapshot. When I went to audit, when you get put on a massive public company, you're probably not going to see the entire side of the audit. It's almost impossible. So the mid-range companies were really exciting to me, just because I got to understand, what different people are focusing on. I think as I started moving up, it gave me more freedom to kind of lean into other departments and see what they were doing, to get more involved in some of these conversations. And you want to understand what drives gross margin. All of a sudden you start thinking about the topics that are really important. What's the cash burn look like? What's the forecast look like? How are your actuals? What programs, as in public accounting, to look at month over month? Okay, well, that's great. If they already forecasted to be what you thought your actual was going to be, that's more important than ever. So just because your numbers are down month over month, if it was already forecasted because of, let's call it, seasonal things, then that's okay. And I started to pay more attention into FP&A and their ability to forecast, because that's an art. I mean, you really need to understand the business, and how important was, if you want another round of financing, how close are your numbers versus what they forecasted, or your numbers all over the place. I remember one investor once told me years ago, if your actuals don't come in line with your forecast, it's either two things, and they both scare him. One is you have no idea what's going on in your business, and you're basically guessing. And number two, your business is relying on so many variable factors that it's almost impossible to predict. And both of those are really scary to an investor. And so that's when you start. And again, this is a break from compliance world of, and back to compliance. Compliance is expected. Like you don't get a gold star for getting your audit done. You don't get a gold star for getting your compliance right. But if you get it wrong, you get you get the red, you get the red, red square, so to speak. But there's
Yeah.
no,
You
hey,
get
great
canned is
job,
what
dude.
happens. Yeah.
There you go. I
Yeah.
mean, like, there's no extra benefit of getting the audit done. That was the expectation. But if you do what you're supposed to do, you build your team properly, you have checks in place, you use software like Flowcast, the audit should just be another thing on the annual checklist, not a, hey, look, I just separated myself out from somebody else motivated.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that speaks a lot to what it's kind of like trying to move people out of that non-value add compliance work, and not that the audit can't have some value. Like you definitely can get some new like line of sight from people. They can, in the audit report, you might get some different feedback on the with governance and everything like that. But at the end of the day, generally, you're kind of worried about how you're running your business, how you're creating your business. And this speaks to probably the second thing I learned as well. I went from understanding that I wasn't worried, I shouldn't be worried as much about compliance. I need to execute compliance, as you said, but like you said, people don't give you a high five for just being really good at compliance. There's like, thank you, I guess, right? Like they just want you to hit a threshold and then move on from there. They want you to be materially correct, materially everything, and then move on to what's important. And so that part of my career, I really looked at like, well, all I'm doing here is managing risk. I'm not eliminating risk. I'm simply managing it to a tolerable level. But then after that, what I learned, and this kind of came from a mentor, and I think it sounds very similar to what you're saying, is accounting has moved from this area of just like reporting and not really mattering to helping craft and tell the story of the business, right? Which is the whole point of accounting in the first place when we think about it. Accounting is the language of business, as Warren Buffett said. And all we're reporting is meant to standardize kind of very disparate like transactions and make them kind of follow one program, one metrics, so that we can report on what's actually happening. And that reporting is really simply telling the story of the operations from the last month, the last quarter, the last year, whatever. So accounting has this whole time been telling the story of what occurred, but now we also need to get involved in the business and help craft the story or the narrative of where it's supposed to go, right? Because that's what happens in your board meeting at the end of the month. All the business leaders get in there and they tell the board, hey, this is what occurred last month. This is where we're going. We told you that the story had this kind of story arc. And as we're writing it, we're kind of making these changes. So you can almost look at it like a media room or a writer's room when they're creating even a TV show, right? Like they have a general outline from what I understand when they write the show. And then week to week, they kind of hone in on the transcripts and get it to where they want it to be. But there's changes along the way. And that's what we're navigating. We're trying to help them narrate the overall line for the year and then say, well, this is what really we think is going to happen next month or next quarter. And so control and involvement in that story is so important to the business, to making good and correct decisions. So like you said, if you have too many inputs that you really don't know what's going on with the business, or you just use the wrong ones, how are you supposed to narrate where it's going? And where I've seen a lot of success in my career working on the FP&A side is helping them understand, like, these are where the true numbers are coming from. This is how transactions actually occur within our business. Because it really is surprising how so many business, like whether it's functional leaders, team leaders, even whole department leaders, don't necessarily understand the big picture of how they make money, right? And accounting sees that whole process. And so we can help influence them, say, well, this is how you actually make it, relate that back to what they're doing. And then now you can kind of tell the story about where you're going.
Absolutely. And you harped on that about writing a story. And the way I kind of look at this is FP&A writes the story for the future, right? But we're forecasting, but they rely on us to make sure that it's achievable. And a perfect example I'll give you is one of the inputs is forecasting how much cash comes in. Forecasting cash that comes in is based on the customers that are paying for this. Who's the boots on the ground? I mean, that's probably the accounting team working with the AR saying, okay, well, FP&A runs a report and says, hey, these are the dates they're due. So we said this is the cash due. Well, did you know this customer pays 10 days late usually? This customer pays 15 days late. All of a sudden now it's a material amount, the cash flow projections are off. And the last thing you want to do is send FP&A to or CFO to board, like, hey, we're going to get X amount. And for sure, because your boots on the ground, to know that this one is probably not going to come in later, come in next month. Let's just make sure we're accurate on that end. So fully support that thought process. It's kind of like, I look at it as FP&A is writing the story. I'm just double checking if the variables and assumptions make sense because we're more on the ground than they are on some of these things. The other aspect I'll add to that is, there's amortization, there's depreciation, there's different things like that that factor into your P&L. Are you coding things properly? Again, like you said, the numbers are going to dictate how people are going to analyze them and forecast them. If you're not lining these things up properly, these numbers don't make any sense. And the last thing you want to do is go into a forecast and say, well, they were amortizing it over 5, we were doing it off of 10. It just looks sloppy. And so for me, I don't know if I want to call that compliance. I call this more management style accounting over here of, you need to be in sync as to if FP&A say this is the category, you need to be in sync with your accounting team. That's what it is. You add that on to departments with your management team, technology, marketing. They're expecting X amount on their P&L for spend every single year. They need to understand some of the background on it. Okay, we prepaid this expense right here. We're going to expense it over 12 months so that they don't think their budget is higher or lower, and you avoid under or overspending specifically on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example of how it really does become more of a focus on managerial accounting at the end of the day, right? You want to make sure you're within the guidelines of GAAP, right? The principles of GAAP, but you definitely then there's still a lot of gray area and a lot of business specific structure that you can put in there, right? Because it's like, well, if I'm just reporting G&A on the income statement or SG&A or however you want to however you need to specifically allocate it, you generally don't need to go into details unless there's some specific kind of disclosure ruling there on where you allocate it in between into your GL account. So work with your finance team to make sure that and your budget owners to make sure that everybody's aligned on where it's going and that you can have it flow through cleanly so that there's less friction in that storytelling. Because you'll never see, you probably can. You can definitely see a CFO more annoyed than this, but one of the most annoyed faces I've ever seen on a CFO consistently is when you're going over your month-end review, your book review, and you're like, oh, well, we're up 2,000 here, but we're down 2,000 here because there's just like an allocation thing, right? And they're like, why are you talking to me? Right? They're like, why are you saying these words? Did this matter? Right? And you're like, no. And that person needs to spend their time on making strategic business decisions, and you're just wasting brain power on saying, well, I just there was this allocation thing that we did, and it's like no one needs to know, no one wants to know. It's not material, and you just need to work with your other functional heads to just say, okay, how do we just make this disappear so that the CFO is making decisions based off that, or even you as the controller, right? Like as you move along and being a controller, you get less involved with the close and you get more involved in more operational and financial tasks of the company. So you also don't want to just be wasting your brain powers with an accounting manager saying, well, hey, we just move buckets. It's like, okay, is it important? No, then let's move on and let's focus on making money.
Yeah, and to that point though, it works both ways, right? So I've seen a balance that's 300,000 and it's 300,000 the next month. And it's 300,000 the next month, and someone will say, oh, well, the variance didn't change, so I left it. Well, how do you know? How do you know that half the areas went up and half the areas don't go down? So I take that, and then I also add a certain threshold saying if it counts over a certain amount, I still wanted you to see it because, like you said, numbers can offset each other, and therefore you think the balance is the same, but it's technically not. I also think it's on your team, right? So luckily enough, at Bluecore, most of the team has been there for 3 years. We're not spending time on that. We're really sitting on the nitty gritty going, explain to me what happened here. Explain to me what happened here. And I think what I tell the team is you should already know what the numbers are going to shake out to be. We should already have an expectation because we know the business pretty well. And so and I hope other teams are not like this either, where, all right, let's see what the numbers shake out to be. It should never be that case. You should know how your business is functioning on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of going back to that comment on managerial accounting. Like managerial accounting doesn't look at month over month variance specifically. It's like you usually look at ratios and in line with expectations, right? So I would always tell my team, they're like, well, hey, I don't know why cost of goods sold went up, 13% this month. I have no idea why it went up 13% this month. It's like, well, how much did sales go up? How much more did we sell? For a retail company, they're directly related. It's like, well, it went up 18%. And I was like, all right, well, what's our, what's our margin difference there? Is it 5%? And it's like, well, yeah. It's like, all right, well, then it sounds like it's in line, right? Like it sounds like that's perfectly in line with what we'd expect. What did inventory turn that month? Related to those things, don't look at month over month. I don't care that cost of goods sold went up 13% over last month. I just want to make sure it's in line with our margin expectations related to revenue and that our inventory is reflecting a similar change. And if it is, then we're good to go, right? Same thing for shipping expense, even like, handling and all that other stuff. So I think that's a great way, that's where you move out of that kind of the getting stuck in the tactical and just looking at, month over month or budget versus actual, and looking at the relationships between drivers, which is where I think, my experience, finance usually has a difficult time, and I'm not saying all finance, I'm not trying to create a stereotype, but generally that's where a lot of finance, so FP&A functions struggle, is understanding that it's about the relationships that are underlying and how the transaction's structured, and not necessarily, well, I built my budget like this, so why didn't it fold the same way? I was like, well, your budget, is built one way and reality happens a different way. So how do we bridge that? So I think that's a great way to look at that. Taking a step back to what you're talking about on your team, this is, for me, this is an area of learning, but, I think in public accounting, you stayed through manager. I left right at the end of my senior timeline. I did 3 years as senior and bounced. And for me as a senior, I was just learning on leaning on my team more, but you're still very tactically in the weeds, kind of doing all of the work. And so when I left the industry, I felt like I, by nature, was taking on a lot of work personally and not delegating it to my team. And that was a lesson I had to learn in industry, was trust and build your team and develop your team, not always just do the work yourself. Is that something you had to learn, or do you feel like being a manager in public accounting and on these large jobs, you'd already kind of learned that delegation and that team investment?
So it depends, right? And I think this is true for most companies, no matter what you do. Treat your employees properly, treat your team properly. They'll stay on. The more continuity you have with your team, the more you give them, the more you let them kind of watch them grow. I would say the beginning of my career, kind of more on the micromanaging kind of side. I used to build out checklists and tasks and make sure things got done. Doesn't mean I don't do it now. I try on the air, because I said my team has been around for about 3 years. The average term of my team has been about 3 years. So I kind of give them flexibility. Maybe last year I would say this is the way I would do it, and I would kind of give them the approach. I'm trying to sit back a little bit and let them see what they come up with. If I see some mistakes getting made, I watch it. I let them make the mistake and come back. If I feel like we're going in a completely direction that I feel like is going to hinder our time or waste time, I'll stop them in there. But I was once told you'll never know what someone's capable of until you actually give them the opportunity. I use the word creativity a lot with my team, meaning on the finance side of it. Just there's not one way to do things. It's more important to come up with the approach. And you've been there, hey Stefan, like, I don't know how to do this. How should I work on it? And then you answer and they go do it. And then you change it. Okay, well, we're all, most of us are CPAs. How would you do it? What do you think we should do? And then all of a sudden the thinking changes a little bit. So I give some guidance. I'm not as, detail oriented on the task as well. So I let other people kind of get involved in there, which is important as a leader, because if you grow, your team grows, your responsibility grows. You don't want to get stretched further. You want to give that responsibility out so you can, do your best work. And obviously we're working in a remote world. Before you know it, you could be on 8 hours, 9 hours of Zoom. And I remember on that panel, a lot of the people raising their hands saying, I don't know when I'm supposed to do my work. And I always thought that was a design flaw of what was being set up within the organization.
Right. And I think that's where, like, I think in my mind, what I found very similar to you is, I used to go into meetings early in my career and say, like, this is how we're going to do things, because I was trying to, get shit done and move the dial. And that's really important in public accounting. Is not always trying to source the best idea. It's about getting the work done and getting things signed, because you're so busy. But, in industry, you generally have a little bit more time and flexibility to do things. And what I learned is by taking a step back, like you said, and asking the team, saying, well, how would you do it if I wasn't here? What would you think? Or saying, hey, this is generally what I think we could do, but it doesn't have to be this way. Now that you guys have heard of an example of how to do this work, do you have other ideas of how to do it? It has blown my way how people with relatively little accounting background, even, they're not even a CPA, might not even be the industry they first started in, will come and be like, well, what if we did X? And again, because they don't have the same background as me, they actually come with a very different solution that is better than mine, right? That challenges the norm and is very simplistic and easy to execute. And it's like, yeah, that's great. You know what? Like, I'm not going to get stuck on my pride. I'm not going to fall on that sword. I think that's brilliant, and I'll learn from this, and let's do it your way, and let's not listen to the way that Stefan wants to do it. And that has been, pretty immense in making bigger progress. And as you said, being creative and not just saying, well, I've audited a bunch of companies and 9 out of 10 did it this way, so it's probably pretty good. And someone says, well, can't we try this? Be like, okay, let's try it. Why not? What's the worst it's going to do to us? We know how to fix it at the end of the day. Would you say using Flowcast has kind of changed the way you're allowed to manage? Because for me, it did at Kodiak Kicks. It changed the way I was able to manage my team.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest sellers on that are obviously people hear productivity tool, they get excited, but then they get annoyed because then they're going, wait a minute, now I gotta sit there and learn how to use this. And I think that the UI is really nice and it's easy for people to use. So I had a new person start last week. She's already up and running on Flowcast, and she'd used different audit tools before. So I think that the adoption to the tool is super important. We're fully transparent on Flowcast on our monthly close. We've been using it for about 2 years. The notes are on there. We have no issues whatsoever. In fact, we're looking to do a refresh on our procedures just to make sure it's more extensive. But I know we've talked about this before, but I'll quickly touch on it. We were using G Sheets. Guess what? On G Sheets, very easy to press backspace with a letter A by accident, and your control is not in place. Auditors brought it up, so obviously great selling point to say, hey, let's get rid of this. I knew when I adopted it, I was like, okay, well, we'll take care of the auditors. Before you knew it, we're using it for all different aspects of it. And I think we're also going to add on some other modules like payroll and FP&A and operations as well. So it's been a great tool. We coincidentally onboarded it right as COVID was starting. And when we all went remote, not realizing we'd be remote for that long. So the timing for us was perfect. Again, like we can talk about productivity tools all day long. I'd say the number one selling point of Flowcast is it's easily integratable and it's very easy to use. And so I'm not spending time having to teach people how to use it.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what I appreciate about a good software that's meant, or system that's meant to solve your problems, is it focuses on the user and it's there to ease communication and work the way you do and not necessarily force you into a new way of doing things. It's adaptable and flexible to the way you want to see and execute against the world, and not saying, well, hey, this is the only way to have it done, because then you lack creativity. You're too rigid and you can't expand, you can't grow and be dynamic. And in my personal opinion, the moment you start being dynamic and changing in business, you might as well shut the doors, because it's just a matter of time until someone closes them on you, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
To kind of pivot a little bit, but I want to talk about this before our time's over, is, what are you learning today, or what are you wanting to learn in the future as you're the controller of Bluecore? Are you trying to pivot your paradigm in any kind of way? I know at one point in time you were talking about doing an MBA, or is there something you're kind of learning with your team or your entity right now that you think could be, is kind of new and unique to you?
Sure, great question. So for me, as much as I've heavily invested in myself, it's also my team, right? And I mean, let's be transparent here. There is a fight for accountants going all across America, right? Everyone's looking for talent. Top talent has the pick of wherever they want to go. And so, you want to be a boss that they trust, or not even a boss, just a leader that they trust, that they believe in you. You got to work on things like work-life balance, something that they're interested in doing. And so my pitching selling point to different team members are technology is number one. We're going to use technology as much as we possibly can. to get rid of mundane things like bank recs, prepaid recs, which Bowcast is helping us out on, different things like that. Because I want you guys focusing more on why versus let me prepare it for someone, serve it on a dish, and let FP&A or the controller or CFO figure out what happened. I want them focusing on why this happened. It's going to make them more dynamic. It's going to make them more interested in it specifically. And it's going to change a little bit of the culture where I think there's a perception or stereotype that the accounting accountants put the numbers together and then somebody else takes it from there. It's not the case. It's very intelligent individuals, all intelligent individuals. We can add value to the business, not only from a cost cutting perspective, but you put together a good treasury plan and say, hey, we raised some funds, we'd like to earn interest. Interest rates are up. You could help the business on that end. So for me, it's about self-development for myself, and also helping out my team. But it's also seeing them grow. I mean, I think most people will tell you this. There's nothing better when you see someone in your team, the light comes on, or they do a presentation to the management team, and the management team sits back and goes, wait, who's that again? Who's that again? And all of a sudden, you see the fruits and labors that you put in as a leader. And so for me, it's how do I make me better every single day? How do I make me think every day so that at some point you do my job, right? That's the goal of all this. So.
Yep. Well, and I think it's the old saying, right? Like rising tides raise all ships, right? And a lot of times I think people get stuck in the fact of trying to control work or seem important or be important. And it's like, I've just noticed that in my life, there's always been enough work to go around. Like you said, when you see someone do better, and sometimes you don't notice it immediately. Like for me, it's like sometimes I'll notice it a few months after the fact. But it's like, you know what? I used to spend so much time looking at inventory at the end of each month before we finished closing the books because it was such a mess. To, you had someone on your team that took ownership of it, wanted to learn, wanted to be a part of it. And the next thing you know, you're like, it just doesn't worry me anymore. I don't sit there on day 3 of the close and say, man, what am I going to find in there to this month? What happened? What did someone mess up? And so it'll be like, this person's identified it, they've taken care of it, and they moved on. And I can focus all that energy into other parts of the business. They do better, I do better, everybody wins, the business does better. And so it's really important to grow those people and help them. And sometimes people aren't motivated to do that. And so I think the challenge as a boss is trying to help motivate them. If you want to be a leader, if you want to be a mentor to them, you got to motivate them and figure out how to get them there. But it is really special when you're like, man, I used to worry about that all the time. And now, like for me, it was like, now Erin is taking care of this and she's killing it and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Or it was Stiza or whoever it is. And they just took care of it and rolled with it, and I could move on with my life. And that was really great. So yeah, I think that's wonderful. What would be your advice, like kind of last comments, like what would be your advice for someone that is looking to enter the controller space, whether it's from public accounting or maybe they're assistant controller? Now they're going to be the controller and the head of the department, the accounting function. What would kind of be your last advice to them?
So my advice to them would be, it's very hard because I'll give you an example. We just hired someone from public accounting. They come in thinking compliance. And again, compliance is important. I'm not saying forget it. The first couple of weeks that you're there, understand the business, understand the key players in the business, and understand how the business works. What are the key metrics? What are the key dates? What are comparables looking at? How are they getting valued? Understand those metrics because, again, you already have the compliance side. Reading that audit report, even though it's going to add value, it's not going to, you already have enough value on it already. Spend time understanding how the other business leaders in the organization look at this. And then rely on the fact that you will do a better job on, let's call it the audit or other compliance matters later when you understand the business. I've seen controllers struggle, even some CFOs struggle, because they're so compliance based. And when they're sitting in some of these meetings, they can't explain the product to you, but they can't explain the business to you. And just like my new hire who started last week, I just told her, don't worry about compliance right now for the first couple of months. Understand the business, that if we run a coffee shop a month from now, and I ask you what were Bluecore's product lines, you can explain it to me. And if you can do that, you will be a better force in the business for you because you'll understand kind of how this works. So that'd be my number one advice to anybody. joining me as a controller.
Yeah, I love that. I think, like you said, focus on your economic engine and understand how you really make money. Because at the end of the day, that's what the business is there for. And at the end of the day, that's truly what you're supporting. It's not compliance. Compliance is ancillary. It's important, but it's ancillary. You need to support what the business is there to do, their mission, their vision. How do you do that? So I think that's wonderful advice. With that, Rohit, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to learn of your story and listen to you and kind of hear the advice you had to give people. Because I think, at least for me, I remember back when I was making this transition, I didn't feel like I had a lot of people I could ask a question to and not feel a little sheepish or dumb. Hopefully this is kind of sharing this information helps everybody. But with that, thank you, Rohit. Thank you for joining for this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. And we hope to see you on the next one.
Thank you. Appreciate the time, guys.